So I can't help but encourage others to participate in conference panels as a way of both networking and getting your name out there and just recognizing that, if nothing else, you're an expert in who you are.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indy Author podcast, I talk with Joanne McLaughlin about elevating your presence with panel appearances, including participating in panels as a way to build confidence, network, and promote one's work. We discuss the importance of contributing meaningfully during panels and the benefits of both genre-specific and non-genre-specific conferences. And we touch on the role of moderators, the structure of panels, and how varied experiences can enhance panel discussions. And now let's hear from Joanne McLaughlin about elevating your presence with panel appearances.
Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guest is Joanne McLaughlin. Hey, Joanne, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing great, thank you. And to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, Joanne McLaughlin's novels include Chasing Ashes, a crime thriller, and Never Before Noon, Never Until Now, and Never More Human, a darkly romantic vampire trilogy. A Poetic Puzzle, a romantic mystery, is coming in early 2025. Her latest short fiction appears in Ruth and Ann's Guide to Time Travel. An editor of prize-winning news and features for newspapers and public media, Joanne is also a former VP of a musician's management firm. She lives in Philadelphia, where she indulges in her love of design and walking. And so, Joanne, you had gotten in touch with me. We know, in fact, a mutual friend of ours, Gary Zenker, was a guest on the podcast very recently. And so we've gotten to chat at some of the events that Gary has organized. And you had gotten in touch with me with what I thought was a great topic for a conversation for the podcast. And I kind of don't want to steal your thunder by saying right up front what it is, but I was wondering if we could just start out and you can talk a little bit about the situation you found yourself in that prompted you to drop me a note and see if I wanted to talk about this on the podcast.
Okay. Not to bore you with too many details, but I had been out of the writing game for several years. My first novels came out. First one came out in 2016, and the last one I published independently in December of 2020, which you would have thought was a very auspicious time for readers, even though you couldn't, because nobody could do anything else, right? But because I was a health editor at the time, and I was very busy, needless to say, I didn't do any promotion at all. So it wasn't until really the end of 2022, beginning of last year, that I kind of got back into the game. And I suddenly found myself looking at conferences and looking at conference requirements and seeing on the registration forms, would you like to be on a panel? Like, why would anybody want me on the panel? I mean, that was my first impression. But then I thought, okay, what the heck? I'll sign up for a panel. And I did it, and it kind of went okay. And then so the next conference, I signed up for more panels, and it went okay. And, nobody laughed me out of the auditorium or the conference room or whatever. And people seemed to think I made sense. And when I went back to at least one of these a second year in a row, people were saying, oh, yeah, I remember last year you said this and so. Right. I wasn't entirely a newbie, but I was enough of a newbie that I thought that my experiences were probably fairly similar to some other people's in terms of building confidence, figuring out that this was a kind of a system that going to conferences and serving on panels was kind of a system that was a win-win for everybody. You got to get out and network, and the conferences, they were great. They were perfectly willing to have me talk.
And when you say you went to the conference, you were at a panel and it went well, what was your criteria there? Like, what made you look back on that when you were done and say, oh, that went pretty well?
Well, I didn't make a fool out of myself. Words actually came out of my mouth. So, I think, as with any group of people, there's a certain chemistry. And one question would lead to the next. The moderators of the panels would say, oh, yeah, Joanne, you just referred to that thing. And can you tell us more about that? Or would segue nicely from one conversation to the next or one comment from the next. And that seemed to be a sign to me that I was contributing in a way that A, made me proud of myself, and B, seemed to satisfy their expectations as well. And I figured, well, hey, I can do this. Everybody can do this. Or everybody should be doing it because you got literally nothing to lose.
Yeah. When the panels that you were on, when you were going into them, did you have any feelings like, oh yeah, these are all authors who were at sort of similar level to me? Or did you have the feeling of these are all people who have been in the game longer or been in the game a shorter amount of time? Like, what was your assessment going into it? All those things?
Totally. Yeah. I think, certain regional conferences are multi-genre. And so, you've heard of some people, you haven't heard of other people. I went to a conference last year where Jeffrey Deaver was the keynote. Everybody's heard of him. And then there were a lot of other people I'd never heard of before. And so there's always a little apprehension there. I know you did a recent podcast with Diane Valera about imposter syndrome. You can't help but feel like an imposter when you walk into a setting where Jeffrey Deaver is the keynote and some people said, we don't know.
I
And
was on a panel with Jeffrey Deaver at a conference that
see,
that either makes you feel like I've really made it or, oh my God.
well, right, exactly. And then I was at another conference where I was sitting on a panel with Greg Frost, who is fairly well known in fantasy and other genres, and John McGoran, who's done several eco thrillers and other novels. So I was like, oh my God, how about this? I can actually do this. So I can't help but encourage others to participate in conference panels as a way of both networking and getting your name out there and just recognizing that if nothing else, you're an expert in who you are. And that's all to the good, I think, as you're promoting yourself in an independent writing environment. I mean, I'm a hybrid now, which I don't have to tell you, a lot of people have a lot of questions about that, but I've been traditionally published, I've independently published, and now I'm in a hybrid situation, which is effectively the same as independently publishing, except you're not project managing your own stuff constantly, which I had enough of with 3 books. Thank you very much. And a couple of short stories. This is a win-win doing it like this.
So when you first started considering the panel opportunities, was it something that you were just going to a conference anyway and you figured you might as well? Or did you have in mind, I want to build my network, or I want to sell books, or I want to lay the foundations for some relationship with these other authors? Did you have a goal like that in mind going into it?
I had a couple of goals. Regarding conferences, most of these conferences, or at least in my experience, when you're registering, it's there. They ask you, do you want to be on a panel? And sometimes they say, okay, we have panels, this and this and this, check the ones you want to be on. And sometimes it's not that specific. Sometimes they say, what are subjects you might want to talk about on a panel? And so you fill in and then you see what happens, see if you get selected or not. But yeah, what I wanted to do more than anything was to network, to get to know both people writing in my genre. So yeah, I wanted to establish myself as a voice that people would then maybe come to me and ask me if I wanted to be on a panel about something. And then, and that has actually happened now. So yes, all of the above.
And that scenario where you had gotten to the point where people were approaching you about being on a panel, was that an end in itself, which would be completely legitimate, or an entree to something else? Like, I know I generally look at panel opportunities in the sense of I want to get word out about the fact that I write and podcast about writing related topics. And so it's sort of an advertising play for me. Did you have an end game there?
I don't know that I had an end game in terms of actual, doing a panel, but for instance, I just registered recently for a conference. I guess this will be my 3rd time going to it. And to the question, do you want to moderate a panel? I said, yes, because I now feel like I can do that. I feel like I'm building my own skills as a public-facing author in a way that several years ago, I wouldn't have dreamed that I could do. I'm not an introvert by any means at all. I'm pretty good at public speaking and usually will speak to just about anybody who will talk to me. But it's a little daunting. And now I feel like I could do it without any problem. We'll see.
I think that's a real good point. In the book that I wrote with Michael Aron called From Page to Platform, How to Succeed as an Author Speaker, we have a section on panels. And that's one of the real pluses, I think, that if people are really nervous about getting up on stage, or like maybe they have a long-term goal of being a solo speaker, but they're feeling really uncomfortable about it, a panel is a nice entree because there you're up there with a couple of other people and you have hopefully a talented moderator who's making the situation productive and enjoyable for everyone. And it can kind of be a way to ease into being on a stage in front of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I was curious about, you were talking about genre or non-genre specific conferences. Did you find that your experiences either as a panelist or even if you've been an audience member at a panel. Did you get different things out of making that choice about whether to pursue genre-specific opportunities or non-genre specific opportunities?
When there was a choice to pursue genre-specific opportunities in a multi-genre conference, I did. But for instance, or a conference I went to 2 consecutive years, there were many more cross-genre topics the first year than there were the second year that I intended. And so you got to do a deeper dive, so that was okay. I got to listen to a whole lot more crime-oriented discussions this year than I perhaps had last year. So that was all to the good too. I mean, I think you can go into these things thinking, oh, well, I'm only going to do this. And then something changes your mind, even if it's just that, oh, I got involved with the conversation and I missed the first 20 minutes of this panel, so I'll go to that panel instead. And I think there are a lot of things you can take away from even just participating in the panels, yes. But participating on the panels, has just been such an eye-opening experience because you do get a much closer look at the individual authors, either in your genre. Or to give you an example, if this makes any sense, at one panel we talked about the restrictions that the term cozy places on authors. And there were some people on the panel who had been traditionally published, pretty big name publishers, and a couple of people who were indies. And they were all like, yeah, we just feel like somebody is holding us by the collar, sometimes. Sometimes. Obviously, they were very happy to have the success that they have. But it was an interesting insight into what other people go through.
Well, I do think that there's a combination of goal setting. I think it's helpful if people say, I want to pursue panel opportunities because I have this end goal, like selling books or like networking with authors or whatever that might be. But I also think it's very important, as you're kind of suggesting, that you go in also just open to what opportunities are going to pop up. I know I've spoken with my buddy and also co-author Mark Leslie Lefebvre about opportunities for short fiction. And he has the story about waiting for a panel to start. And he was sitting with his fellow panelists and they got chatting and Mark writes horror. And the person who was on the panel was curating an horror anthology and didn't realize that Mark wrote horror. And so Mark ended up getting a story in that anthology. That is not something he would have gone into that panel saying, oh, I hope what I get out of this is that I get a story placed in a horror anthology, but being open to that. And part of that is chatting with your fellow panelists, chatting with the moderator, chatting with the attendees after you've wrapped up. All sorts of fun things can come out of that.
And to your point about selling books, I was on a panel last year, I want to say, and in the audience of this panel was the husband of a fellow author. And he had been around the conference the whole weekend, and I had introduced myself to him because he had bought one of my vampire books. He picked up the vampire book, and as it happened, because I had to republish the first book after my traditional small press went under, the copyright dates would suggest that the second book came out before the first book. So I said, oh, no, you don't want to buy that one first. You want to buy this one first. So we talked, and we're standing around, and I'm missing the start of a panel that I was going to go to but not participate on, fortunately. And we started to talk. And so I showed him all 3 books. And I said to him, well, if you buy all 3, I'm offering this discount. He bought all 3. Okay. Fast forward a year, I'm sitting on this panel with Greg Frost and John McGoran and any number of people at a genre-specific or more genre-specific conference. This guy's at the back of the room. Same guy, because his wife was participating in this panel. And we're talking about, it was a panel about horror in all sorts of genres, as opposed to explicitly horror. And so there was a question from the audience directed to me about my vampire books. Well, this individual is sitting behind the questioner and saying, you have to read her books. They're fantastic. And the woman at the end of the panel came up and bought my books. Oh, fine.
Yeah, that's a lovely story.
It's just, as you say, it's just like, okay, wow, here's this opportunity. And we got to know each other, and it was great.
Yeah, you're not going to have those serendipitous opportunities unless you put yourself out there in order to make yourself available for them to happen. I was also interested in what you were saying about the role of the moderator, or the fact that you were going to be acting as a moderator, had acted as a moderator. And I think it's great that you've had the experience as a panelist. So I think it would be very difficult to moderate a panel without having first been a member of a panel, because it's important to see it from both sides. And I know that when I started moderating panels, I thought back to my experience as a panelist, and I started going through my checklist of the things that made me crazy when moderators did it on a panel I was on, or things that I'd seen moderators do that were really excellent that I wanted to reproduce. And one of them was that it always makes me crazy when moderators, like, let's say you have 3 panelists in a row, and the moderator always starts with the panelist that's closest to them. They'll say, I have a question. And they always start with panelist A and then go to B and go to C. So of course, C is like every time they get to C, there's nothing left for that person to say other than, yeah, what they said already. And the importance of doing things like rotating who you throw the question out to first in order to make it equitable for everybody. But I do think that one consideration if I were advising people about that is you have to go into the situation of moderating a panel. Well, I'm going to take back what I was going to say. I was going to say you have to be a little more selfless about it, because I think the payoff is less for a moderator, because the moderator's whole role is to sort of make the participants shine, not necessarily make themselves shine. But I do think that being a moderator then gives you that social cred that's even like a step up in the panel hierarchy of if you're being asked to moderate panels, that's just an acknowledgement of your experience and your perspective and so on. So it's very cool. Yeah. Is this something you've already moderated the panel, or is that coming?
Not yet. I'm hoping to. I volunteered.
Yeah.
Raised my hand, so we'll see what happens.
Well, the other thing that this is a plea I send out to, this is sort of targeted at organizers, is it also makes me crazy when people put 7 panelists on a panel. So if we're just talking about the logistics of panels, I say if there are more than 4 panelists, I don't know. I don't find those as fun.
That's true. And I think you have to mix it up too, a little bit. I think if you have, unless it's about some experience in their lives that draws them together, you got 4 cops or something like that. Or, I don't know, former music teachers or something. I'm making this up, obviously. I think having a diversity of types of people also makes for a better panel. That's just me. I think it gives that 7th person, that 7th unfortunate person on the panel, something else to say.
Yeah.
That will be different from the other 6.
Yeah. That's a great point. I also think that suggests the idea that oftentimes, especially if it's a genre-specific panel, if you go into a crime fiction conference, you're a crime fiction writer, then chances are if you're invited to be on a crime fiction panel, it's going to be kind of a match. But I have been on panels where it really wasn't a match. And it's because the organizers were trying to accommodate a whole bunch of potential panelists, and they can't always slot people into one that's a perfect match for their area of expertise. Have you had that experience? How closely were the topics of the panels you've participated on in alignment with your what you would think of as your area of expertise?
I think probably in the earliest panels I did, they were pretty generic. And I think that's a good thing, because I think that if you're somebody unused to doing this sort of thing, that the best thing you can do is talk about your own experience as a writer, or some experience you've had that has led up to your being at this conference as a published author. Mm-hmm. But for instance, in the fall at the Creatures, Crimes, and Creativity Conference down in Columbia, Maryland, I was on a panel about writing sex scenes. Now, okay, I've written 3 vampire novels. I say in my bios most of the time that I write sexy vampire fiction. It's about seduction, right? But I was on this panel with a woman who wrote both traditional romance and erotic romance. A woman who I think has written science fiction romance. Oh. And a woman who writes urban fantasy, really kind of hardcore crime stories, lots of drug dealers, lots of pimps, lots of prostitutes. And so we were kind of all coming at the same topic from fairly different perspectives. And what was interesting about it is that we all sort of said our piece, and it kind of went off a little bit onto a tangent of when it's porn and when it's not. But it also became a conversation about choreography and perspective and who's narrating the sex scene. Yeah. And so from that point of view, it was really interesting. I'm pretty sure that the only reason I ended up on that panel was because of my bio.
Yeah.
Joanne McLaughlin writes sexy vampire novels. So,
well, I remember going to an international thriller writers conference years ago, and they had one of those how to write sex scenes sort of panels. And they had like Lee Child was on it. There was another author who was like really more well-known for writing pretty racy books, and C.J. Boggs. And if you've read C.J. Boggs' books, they're pretty wholesome. And it was really interesting because he kind of started out like, I don't know how I got on this panel. Like, I don't know what I'm going to say. I don't really have sex scenes in my book. It's all very. And then she came in from the barn and she had hay in her hair, and and her kids knew that mom and dad had been having a literal roll in the hay. But it was very good, exactly as you were saying, because as they talked, each of them was talking about why they showed, how they made the decision about how much to show on the page, how much to imply. And even someone who had no sex scenes at all, like zero sex in their books, it would still be interesting because the conversation about why the person had made that choice would be an interesting panel discussion. It's kind of the perfect example of saying you can probably offer a valuable perspective almost regardless of what the topic is, if the general theme is related to writing or whatever that might be.
And how many conferences have you been to? I know I've been to a lot of them where they've got like whole hours devoted to process.
Yeah.
When do you write? How do you write? How do you deal with writer's block? How do you deal with the endless editing? Everybody, the person who's self-published one book can be on that panel.
Yeah.
Because we all have different perspectives. And I think that's what makes the notion of the conference panel something that is so accessible to just about anybody along the continuum, whether you've got one book in your little stack in front of you under your name tag, or you've got like 3 stacks with 6 books apiece, which I've seen. And I think it's what offers the opportunity to just simply say, I can do this. I don't have to, they're 50 minutes, an hour, maybe at the most, these panels.
Mm-hmm.
If you're one of 4 or 5 people on the panel, what does that come down to? Like maybe you're going to talk for 12 minutes or something?
Yeah.
All together, and it's not a continuous like monologue. Anybody can do this.
Yeah, and I think that this isn't exactly about imposter syndrome, but that idea of kind of understanding the etiquette of being a good panelist is, 1, not being a mic hog, but 2, going in, recognizing that you're there on the panel for a reason. There's an expectation you're going to contribute something. Mm-hmm. So selflessly saying, I have nothing else to say, is you're not living up to your responsibility as a panelist. Right. You have to go in having kind of thought through what the topic is and being ready to share some perspective.
Sure. And even if you freeze, there are like 4 other people, 3 other panelists and a moderator to be your safety net.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that it sounds like you've had great luck with your panels, because what you were describing about the kinds of conversations that occurred, the kind of interaction, the learnings that all the panelists had, as well as the people in the audience, I think are great hallmarks of good panelists and a good moderator. So that's really fun to hear.
Yeah, they've been pretty good. I have to say probably the panels I've enjoyed least have fortunately been the ones I've been in the audience with. And sometimes things just don't click the way you want them to. Yeah. Or again, the panel goes off on a tangent. Like, okay, how did they get there?
Yeah, that's it. Kind of a moderating graduate level is reading the room and saying when that this is no longer a fun little side note. You have to kind of rope people back in. I think people are hearing the message that we're saying this is a great opportunity. They should take advantage of it. Was there anything that helped you get to that point, either like experience you've had outside your writing and publishing life, or just some other life experience that helped you get to the point where you could say, oh, you know what, this is something I want to do, and it's something that I'm good. What's the Stuart Smalley? I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me. Like, what got you over that hump of committing enthusiastically to the panel experience?
Well, I spent a whole lot of my life as an editor. And when you're an editor, you're essentially a teacher. And I can remember having gone at one point totally cold into teaching a course at Temple University. And it wasn't a journalism course, it was a public relations writing class. So it was sort of the reverse of everything I'd done. Instead of receiving the press releases and hearing the pitches, I was trying to teach people how to do this or make a presentation, draw up a campaign. And I was a little apprehensive in the beginning. And my son, who's a school teacher, said, well, Mom, it's just acting. You can do that. You've been teaching your entire life. You can, you just get up there and you play the part of somebody who knows public relations because you do. Okay. I managed to get through a semester, It worked out okay. And I thought, well, if I can do that kind of cold, I can do this. I can talk about my process. I can talk about choreographing a sex scene. I can talk about any number of things. I can talk about music in stories because I've got a certain amount of background in the music industry, although that's probably a stretch. My husband managed blues musicians and I made cold calls to record companies back in the day.
That's pretty cool.
And did public relations for musicians. But I can speak to sort of the effort of knowing the process of booking a band somewhere. I have to have that kind. I had enough diverse experiences in my life. I can do this.
Yeah. Well, I think it's very interesting that advice that your son gave you, because coincidentally, in a couple of the recent podcast episodes, my guest and I have gotten onto this. Like, if you're an introvert and you're attending a conference, like, how can you get over it? If you've been tapped to give a presentation, you're feeling nervous about it, how can you get over it? And the theme that keeps coming up is just pretend like you're a person who feels comfortable doing this. I think it's really valuable. At some point, I'm going to think about this enough. I'm going to write a book for authors about how to pretend your way to whatever you want to achieve. Because I think that idea of like, you're getting ready to go into the social event at a conference, and this is the last thing in the world you want to do. But if you say to yourself, you know what, I'm going to pretend like I'm a person who loves to go to the social events, I think it really helps.
I think we've all sometimes felt like we were faking it until we made it.
Yeah.
But hey, we're fiction writers, most of us, many of us.
Yes.
If we can write characters who do it, we can write a script for ourselves.
Yeah.
Presumably.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Yeah, I love that line. I love the line about writing a script for ourselves. I think that's a perfect way to wrap up a conversation about sort of the mega topic here, which is overcoming imposter syndrome and putting yourself out there. And panels is just one way to do that.
Right. And again, you've got nothing to lose.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's excellent advice just in general for people's writing and publishing journeys. So, Joanne, it was so much fun catching up with you and so much fun to talk about panel opportunities with you. So please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Oh, you can go to me at JoanneMcLaughlin.net. That's
excellent.
Joanne with an E.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Joanne.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Joanne. What are some of the best experiences or insights you've gained from participating in conference panels or networking events? I would love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube. And if you're looking for more best practices related to participating in a panel, pick up a copy of From Page to Platform, How to Succeed as an Author Speaker, where Michael Aran and I dedicate a whole chapter to that topic. Check it out and start leveling up your author speaker game today. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.